I'm gonna get so you guys can continue working on the last week example project. We had this project from last week. So if I run this code, hang on. So what we have so far is basically, hang on, that's not the right code. We had two paths, the home path and then the item list path. So basically the item list will show you all the items in the database. Okay, so if you go to your browser and then if you here you go. So if you go to your browser, that's my home page, and if you say item underscore list, that's going to give you the items. This is from the database. Okay, right. And then we did base.html, we did extend from base.html, and then yeah, so you don't need base.html for today's prac. Today's prac is all about all about URL parameters. I'll give you an introduction about URL parameters, and then using the REST framework. You're not implementing REST, you are using a framework. You're going to install that framework, and that framework can work with Django. The framework will do everything for you. All you need to do is just install it and then just configure the installed apps in your Django project. Then REST API is done. Okay. So let's go back. Now, before we start on today's prac task, can you guys go to extensions in Visual Studio Code, and then can you install REST client? So once you install REST client, you will be able to send GET requests, POST requests, put, delete any HTTP request in Visual Studio itself. You don't need to switch to the browser to test your web app. Does that make sense? It's going to be super convenient for you. You can plan all your test cases, you can have test scenarios, and then you can save them in a file, and then you can maintain them in the project itself. Okay, I'll show you. So this is my project, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my root of the project. So that's the root of the project, and then can you guys create a new file? Let's name it as test.http. Just make sure that you have this extension .http, because when you have the .http extension, the REST client will recognize this file. The REST client extension that you just installed, it's going to recognize this file, and it's going to recognize the syntax in this file. So if you want to send a GET request, all you need to do is just simply say GET and then the URL. So what's the URL? That was the URL, right? There you go. And then simply click on send request. So if you click on send request, so that's the response from the server. These are the response headers, and that's the response body. Does that make sense? Now, if you are to do this test case, in the browser, you have to go to the browser, you have to go to network tab, and then you have to refresh, you have to send the request again so that it can capture the request and the response. And then if you click on the request, if you click on that, whatever the request that you sent, do you see requested URL and then the request method, and then you can see the response headers, request headers, everything over here. And if you want to see the response body, you have to go to response. This is the way you can do testing with the browser, but it's too much of work. All right, I'm pretty sure nobody wants to go through all these steps, so therefore it's better to use this extension REST client. And then if you want to send another GET request, you can create another block. To create another block, you have to use 3 hash symbols, so that will create another block, and then you can have another GET request. And then here we go, you can send another GET request to some other URL. And if you want to see how this looks like in the browser, you can save the response. You can see here, save response body. You can save the response as an HTML file in your hard disk. So save your response as an HTML file in your hard disk, and then double click on that file, it will open in the browser. Okay, or else if you basically want to send a GET request in the browser, just press Control key and then press on that URL, it will open the browser, and then it will send a GET request to that, whatever the URL specified. All good? Right. Now the next thing is you can send post request. Now when you're sending post request, you will have to send some data in the body of the request. This is how you can send data. So your data should be in JSON format, and also make sure that your content type is also application/JSON, the content type. Okay, right. So this is in JSON, some data. You can say name is equal to maybe Apple. This is JSON data. Price, let's say 10.5. Likewise, you can send the data in the body. And also you can use put, delete, and then all the other requests. You may use, if you want to know more about this, you just use ChatGPT and then ask GPT to send a request using, say, a REST client, and then it'll give you the syntax. Okay, right. And then you can save these test cases in your test file. If you want to have another set of test cases, yes, you can create another file, have a bunch of test cases, and then you can save it. So you can have test scenarios. One test scenario is for the admin backend testing. One test scenario is for the task creation, maybe like task deletion, or just view the task inside a category, likewise. Right. So today what we're going to do is we're going to we're trying to get items with an ID. Now last week we took all the items at once, right? Now today what we're going to do is we're going to say item/1. We just want one item with the ID 1. Does that make sense? And maybe item/2. We just want that item object that has the ID 2. Item/3. So that means we just need to fetch the item that has the item ID 3. Does that make sense? Right. Now do you see this parameter? It can change, right? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Likewise, it can change, right? Now that is what you call a URL parameter, because it's changing. So in Django, let's say this is your URL parameter. This is the URL with the URL parameter. In Django, what you can do is go to your urls.py file, and let's have a new URL, path, item, and then I'm going to have a new view as well. Oh. Right, so let me create a view as well. Hang on. All right, I'm going to take a copy of my home view, and then create a view with the name item, and then I'm going to import that view over here. All good? Right. So to catch that URL parameter, you have to use angular brackets. These are the angle brackets, the angular brackets, and then you can say item ID. You can name it in any name you want, and then the view does not accept another parameter, right? You have to change the view as well. So your view, your item function in views.py, you can accept item ID as a separate parameter. Now make a note on this name and then this name, they must be the same. If you change this name, you better change the parameter name here. Does that make sense? Right. Now if I run this code, before we run this code, let's try to return this ID back to the client, so that we know when you send a request, if you get a response with the item ID, we know the server has correctly captured it. All right, so let's return an HTTP response. I'm gonna say item is, there you go. Right. So that's it. So if you send a request now, well, hang on. I didn't say my urs.py, my bad. Right. So if you send a request now, yep, so item is 2, and if you change this to maybe like, let's say 90, 290, it should give you 290. Does that make sense? So the server is correctly capturing your URL parameter. Right. Now the next thing is, what do you guys think about this? Let's say I just send ABC123. What do you guys think? Is it going to return a response, a proper response, or is it going to return 404 not found? Look at my view function, look at my urs.py. What do you think? It's a pretty easy question though. But I haven't enforced it. This will catch any string, anything. If you send this request, it's gonna say the item is ABC123. I haven't enforced the type of the URL parameter. If you know the type must be an integer, because we don't have any items in our database with such IDs. ABC123 is not a valid ID if you query the database, but we did not query the database here, so that's why it's working. If you try to query the database with that ID, it's going to crash. I'll show you an example of a crash later on. So this should be an integer ID, right? If you know the URL parameter has a type, you can enforce it. You can say, okay, int colon. So basically that item ID must be an integer. If you send something else, what will happen? 404 not found. All right, so if you send something else, well, hang on, I need to save that file. Oh, still reloading. Okay, let's send a file. There you go, 404 not found. Okay, right. Okay, so that now so basically this is about enforcing the type for the URL parameter, and apart from int, there are other types. There are other types that you can use. Now, if you go to my wiki, if you go to router, these are the other types that you can use. You can use int, you can use string, you can use slug. Slugs have special sort of format, and then you can have UUID values. Now my question is, what's the difference between ID, like having an integer, and a slug? Not the difference. What's the advantage of having a slug compared to an integer ID?
Slug is like a parent.
Like what? It's a unique name. Let's say it's a unique name for the item. For that item, so let's say you have a book. The name of the book is Django Basics, and it's unique. Assume that it's unique. Okay. You can't have the same slug for two different items, two different books. It's a unique ASCII name. ASCII means it's not a numeric. It just has I would say letters and numbers. It's a name that you can remember. So what's the advantage of using a slug over an integer ID? It's easy to remember. If I ask you to give me the ID of a book named Machine Learning for Beginners, you will never know the ID, right? Because your database might have like 1,000 books, and it's really hard to remember the ID. But we as humans, it's very easy to remember the name, isn't it? So we can quickly come up with the slug. It's easy to remember from user's point of view. So using a slug is advantageous from user's point of view. And then what's the biggest advantage? It's good for search engines, search engine optimization. When somebody search for Django basics in Google, Google will have a better idea if you are using slugs. Google will not have a good idea if you're using IDs. Does that make sense? So basically these URLs are SEO friendly, search engine optimization. SEO stands for search engine optimization, so SEO friendly. A person could quickly find the right page for Django Basics book. Right. Let's move on. So we are working with an integer ID, right? Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to send an integer ID. So let's say I send 23, or maybe let's say item 1. And if I send a request, why do I get an internal server error? Okay, first of all, please keep in your mind the status code 500 means your program has crashed. Your view function has crashed. Server is not crashed, server is still running, but that view function is crashed. It's an abnormal exit. Does that make sense? The view function was not able to return something to the client. It has crashed in the middle, which means this view function, this one. What's the error?
Item ID should be an integer.
Yes. Now it's an integer. Remember we enforced the type, so therefore you need to cast it to string, because you're adding a string to a string. Now if you send the same request, it'll work. Now for your assignment, if I see this error for the test cases that I ask you guys to do, two things can happen. I'm going to ask you the reason behind that crash. If you are able to explain it, you get marks. If not, you're losing marks. Okay? So thoroughly test your code. I'm okay with having 500 internal server errors, but you definitely need to know what's going on, what went wrong actually. Does that make sense? So for that, you need to have a very good understanding of your code. Right. Okay. So that's the urls.py file, and then this is the views.py file. Okay. Right. So next, let's see how we can grab the item object from the database. So we say item.objects.get, and then you can say id equals item id, and that's how you get an item object. That's how you get the item object with the item id, with the given item id. Okay, so that's my item object, and then this time I'm going to return the name of the item. Alright, so once I return the name of the item, just go back to your test case, send the request, and it should give you, I don't have an item with the item ID 1, by the way. My item ID starts from 3. So this should give you an internal server error. There you go. Item is apple. I have item 4 as well, orange. Now, what will happen if you send an item ID that does not exist in the database? What will happen? Not 404. Definitely not 404. What will happen? This will fail, right? So it's going to fail with an internal server error. It's going to crash. Okay, so you need to handle it. We didn't handle this error, so that's why it's giving you 500 internal server error. So if I let me show you. So let's say 40, send a request. There you go, internal server error. That's because we did not handle it. Maybe it might not be this line causing the crash, it might be this line, because this is null and then you are trying to take the name of a null object. So if you, maybe I'll just comment this out, I'll remove that, and then let's see. Yeah, still the same. So it's not that line, it's actually the line above. You're trying to, if you try to get an object that does not exist in the database, clearly that is going to fail. Right, now there is a function. Let me close this minimap. Right, so there's a function called get object of 404. So this is a safe way to get an object from the database. So all you need to do is, instead of directly fetching the item from the database, just replace that with, maybe I'll just take a copy, replace this with get item, get object of 404. Now you need to pass get object of what type? Item type, comma, and then the ID is equal to item ID. Does that make sense? Right, now if you do this, this should work. Let's go back, and if you send a request to a non-existing item, it's going to give you 404. Now you need to understand that in your view, in this function, that function is not going to return null. It's going to return 404 back to the client, and that's it. You're not going to this line. Does that make sense? If there is an object, if there is an item ID, and that item, let's say this item ID does not exist in your database, so in that case, this function is not going to return. It's going to return 404 back to the client, and it's going to exit. That's it. It's a proper way of dealing with that error. Does that make sense? Right, don't think that this function is going to return and therefore it is returning our HTTP response with the status code 404. It's not like that. It is basically that function will never return. It will pretty much return the 404 error page to the client, and that's it. It's going to exit the whole execution. Right. So that's done. So let's have a look at, let's try to send this to a template file. Let's try to send this to an HTML template, and then we'll try to display the information about an item. Okay, so how do we do this? Once again, you have to use the render function, and let's say I have this template item.html, and then you have to pass the object in a dictionary. Okay, so you are passing the object in a dictionary, and then I'm going to create a new template, and then you should name the template as item.html. That's my app. There you go, template. Let's create a new file, item.html, and then if you type the exclamation mark and press enter, it's going to give you that boilerplate HTML code. And then over here, let's do h1 item information, and let's do maybe h3 item name is, how do you print the item name? Remember, you have to use this name, okay, the key. So you can say item.name. Does that make sense? Item.name. Now this is not a collection of items, it's just like one single object. Last week it was a collection of items. That's why we had to use a for loop to iterate the objects in that collection. So this week this is not a collection, this is a single object. Right, and then you can print the other fields such as description, and then price likewise. Okay, right. So if I run the code, sorry, if I send a request, once again for a non-existing ID, of course you'll get 404, and for an existing ID, you should get your page. Apple, this is description, Apple 10.00.
Why we offer that 404 error instead 500 error? Like for the debug?
No, it's not like that. 500 is server crash.
Yeah.
When you develop a standalone application,
Yeah.
you know, if your application is crashing, let's say you are trying to divide 1 by 0, it's going to crash. It's a runtime crash. Yes.
Ah, got it.
It's basically your view function has crashed. It's an exception. It's a runtime exception.
Oh yeah.
So the way the server indicate that there has been a runtime exception is sending the response code 500. 404 means you have handled that case. You have handled that case means in a standalone application, if somebody wants to divide some number by 0, if you are to handle that, you're going to say, okay, if the divider is equal to 0, you're going to display an error message, right? 404 is kind of like an error message. You have handled that case. You have not let your server crash. That's why it's always recommended to use 404 and then handle your error cases. Do not leave your error cases unhandled. If you unhandled your error cases, 500 response code will be there. That's why I said during your assignment demonstrations, if I see this error for some of my test cases, I'm going to ask you why your view or why your server has crashed. It's not the server, it's the view, okay? Because server is still running, do you see? Server is still running, it's not crashed. There's no errors over here. But the server is intelligent enough just to crash that view function. So the view function will be terminated unexpectedly. It's an abrupt termination, abnormal termination. Right. So if you get this error, 500 internal server error, not this one, 500 internal server error, you should be able to explain the reasons behind it. So therefore, try your best not to have that error. Instead, have 404. It's better. So which means I know that you have handled that case. Right. So that's the first part. Wait, hang on. Let's see what else do we have to do. We have sent that item to a template file, and we have displayed the information. And if you want to see this in the browser, just simply press the control key and then press on that URL. Just click on the URL. It will open the URL in the browser. Okay. Right. Let's talk about 404 error message. Okay, so if you try to send this request, you'll get a 404 error message. But do you see the body? That is the default body that is given to you by Django. This is the default body given to you by Django. So if you click on this URL, this is how it looks in the browser. So if you want to have a custom 404 error message or error page, there are a few things that you can do. First of all, go to your views.py and then write a new view for the custom 404 error message. I'll take it from one of my other pracs. Just give me a second. Alright, so that's my view function, and this function will be called every time Django wants to send a 404 page to the client. This function will be called. Do you see the parameters? Request, well, we all know what request is, and then there is another parameter, exception. The exception object will literally tell you the exact problem, because here, if you are going to get, like here in this case, if the item does not exist in the database, that's the error, right? There could be some other errors that Django wants to send a 404 error message to the client, and then you can get the information about the exception itself using this exception object. You can be specific. What happened to send to send a 404 error message. You can get that information from the exception. Now here, if you have a 404 error message, in this case, the exception will have a message. This object, you can take the message. The message will have, okay, you're trying to get an object that does not exist in the database. So you know exactly what has happened. Right, so what are we doing here? We are sending a simple HTTP response, cannot find the content, and then the status code is 404. That's the response code. Okay, right. So that's the first thing you can do. What's the second thing? The second, this is basically defining a view, right? So how do we call this view? We need to configure it in which file?
Settings.
Not settings.
You.
Yes, URL. You're right. URS.py. That's what we did, right? All this time we did a view, and then the next thing is the URL.py, so that somebody can call this function. So in your URS.py, this time we are not going to add a path, because it doesn't make sense to add a path. You are not literally requesting a 404 page. Django needs to send it, right? So Django has a special variable. It's called handler 404. This is a special variable that points to this function, whatever the function that the custom function that you just made. So you need to set this pointer. It's a reference. So it's a global variable, handler 404. Just set it to your custom function error 404. So Django will, every time when there is a 404 page requirement, if Django wants to send a 404 page, it's going to call this function, which is this function. It's gonna call this handler, and handler is pointing to this function, so therefore this function will be called. Okay, right, that's step number 2. And in Django, it'll still not work. Okay, so if you send a request, see, well, we didn't get our custom page. It is still the default page. There is another requirement, there is another change that you have to do. In Django, if you are running your server in the debug mode, 404 page will not be, like, your custom page will not be called. Your custom view function will not be called. You can't have a custom 404 page. You need to turn off the debug mode. How do you turn off the debug mode? There you go to settings, and then turn that off to debug mode. Just say false. Now the moment that I do it, and when I save it, look at the error. It'll give you an error over here. What does it say? You must set settings.allowed host. Settings is this file. Allowed host is this configuration. If debug is false. All right. To get rid of this error, you need to specify the IP addresses of the allowed host. Now, to keep things simple, I'm going to use allow all. Star means allow all. It's a wildcard. Right. Now, it should work. You can start the server, and then you can send a request, and it should work. Alright, so there's a typo. So in your urs.py, just correct that typo. It's not handler 404, handler underscore 404, it's just handler 404, okay? Just correct it. And then if you send a request, there you go. That's your custom reply. So Django is calling that function error 404, which is defined in your view. This function, and then you're returning a simple text, cannot find content, with the 404 error code, and that's what you see over here. Right. Okay, what is REST? REST stands for representational state transfer. Okay, that's some technical jargon. Just let's forget about the meaning of that word. Think about this. This is your server and this is your client. Okay, the server will expose something called API endpoints. These are the endpoints that you can talk to the server, that you can use to talk to the server. And only through these endpoints you can talk to the server. There are no other endpoints, okay? You need to expose these endpoints. Now, in Django, how did we manage to serve templates? How did we manage to not serve templates? How did we manage to call view functions? Through URLs, right? Different URL patterns triggered different view functions, isn't it? Likewise, different URLs here will talk to different API endpoints. Do you see? This is a GET request, this is your root URL, and then item/1. When you send a GET request with that URL pattern, it's gonna get an item. So you're talking to that URL endpoint, API endpoint. And that endpoint is all about whenever it receives a URL request, it's gonna get an item. That's it. Let's say you want to create an item. So if you want to create an item, you can use post request. So if you look at the domain, if you look at the URL, do you see the URL? It's different to this one. And also the type is different. Do you see? Post, the HTTP request type. So it's a post request, and then domain/item. That's the URL is also different. And then this is your body. And these are the information that you want to insert. And this request will go to another API endpoint. Does that make sense? In other words, it's another view function. And then whenever that view function is called, it's going to create an item object in the database. All good? So likewise, you can have an URL API endpoint for update, and then you can have an API endpoint for delete. And then do you see different request types? This is, you can use post or you can use put. And if you're updating an item, you must specify the ID. When you are creating an item, you can't specify an ID because you don't know the ID beforehand. And when you are deleting an item, you definitely have to specify the ID. Now you must be thinking that URL and then this URL is pretty much the same thing, right? But what's the difference? HTTP method. Does that make sense? HTTP method. Right. Now let me show you the concept of representational state transfer. Why is this called REST API? Like that, this API is called REST API, and these are the REST API endpoints. Imagine that you have an object, like an item object in your database. So it's in the server side, right? Now you know how to get this object to the client side. You can simply send a GET request, isn't it? Yeah. So this object is replicated at the client side. Now at the client side, if the client changed the name of an item, do you have a way to communicate with the server? Communicate that change with the server so that the object of the server and the object of the client, they are sort of in sync. Does that make sense? If the state of this object is changed, you can use these methods to communicate the state of that object with the server so that the server can sync its state. So do you see? Representational state transfer. So if there is a state change of this object, you can use this method, such as, for an example, if somebody changed the name of an item, it's a change of the state, right? If somebody changed the name of an item, you can quickly send a post request update to update that item. Does that make sense? So the object here and then the object there will be in sync at any given time. That's why the REST has the name representational state transfer. You're transferring the state of an object from one place to another through this API. All good? Right. Now one thing that you can do with these API endpoints is you can come up with a weather server. You know, you can come up with a web app, a weather server, but you don't have a front end. You don't have this front end, but you have the API with the server side. You only develop the server side because you have all the information about the weather. Assume that it is the case. So you can talk to the weather stations, you can look into their databases, and then what you have done is you have simply put up an API, REST API with API endpoints to give information about the weather. Now let's say some random person in the world develops a front end and he doesn't have access to this weather information. Everybody doesn't have access to the weather information, right? So he would pretty much, what he'll do is he will pay to you, he'll pay you to get access to these API endpoints. That's where authorization and authentication comes in. You can authenticate these requests. When somebody sends a request to one of these endpoints, you can allow the authorized users to use that API at that endpoint. Does that make sense? So that person will pay you, or if it's freely available, then well, there's no need to pay. If it's not something freely available, some APIs are not free, some APIs are free, such as ChatGPT. They also have an API, right? Basically, the way it works, if you want to take service from another person, you just send a request to that API endpoint. Now, in the example that I took, if you are running a weather server, a server that exposes the server that sends out the weather information through a REST API, the other person who develops the front end doesn't need to develop the back end. Why? It's already there, and all you need to do is just simply send a request. And the server will respond to it. Now this time, is it going to respond to, will the server respond to the request with an HTML file or with a JSON file? JSON. APIs will generally respond to you in JSON format. Some APIs will respond to you in XML, but nowadays it's always JSON. Let's talk about JSON format. When you are sending a post request, let's say you are using JavaScript to send a request to the API, you can use JSON to send information. And your content type, there is this header. This header is coming from request header. This is one of the request headers. You have to set the content type as application/JSON. Let's say you're not using JavaScript to communicate with the API or to send a request to the backend. Let's say you are using a form. Now in your assignment, you have to use a form, right? Now in the form, you fill up all the details, and when you click on submit, and the form will send a post request, right? The form can also send a GET request. Let's say the form sends a post request. That request is going to look like this. Do you see the content type? Do you see the way the information is encoded? It's completely different, right? JSON looks like this. You have, JSON, you have the key, you have the value, you have the key, you have the value. But when it comes to forms, it's going to look like key equals value, and means the next pair. Key equals value. If you have a space, you might want to use the quotation marks. If you have a space, if you have spaces for the key or the value, you need to use quotation marks. If not, you don't need to use quotation marks. And then you have an and this is the third key value pair. This encoding is different to JSON encoding, okay? Right, so when you submit the form, it's going to send a request like this to the server. And if you are sending a GET request, of course you can do that. The GET request will look like this. Do you see this question mark? Question mark indicates that's the end of the URL. Rest is key value pairs. I'll show you an example. So you know in Google, to go to Google, let's say you go to Google and then you search for apples. All right, look at the URL. What do you guys think? Is it using a GET request to send the query word, or is it using post request?
Yeah.
GET request. Why do I say that? Do you see? There's a question mark over there, and then that's the key equals value, and then that's the value, and then that's the next key. We have an AND sign over there. That's the next key, that's the value. Does that make sense? So Google is sending a GET request with your query and then some other information to the server. Get requests are very fast. Keep that in your mind, but it's very insecure. Why? Everybody can see what you have typed because it's encoded in the URL itself. Post requests are secure. Why? You can't see anything unless you get into the HTTP request and then look at the body. Now, none of these are secure if you're not using HTTPS. A person can simply do a man in middle attack. Pretty easy. Okay? That man in the middle attack is not hard, and it's a pretty easy attack that you can do on anyone's on someone's data stream. Okay. Going back to REST. Now today we are not going to implement different view functions for get, create, update, and delete. Now for your assignment, you will have to do that. I think update is not there. Create and delete is there, right? Yeah. So today we are not create and delete. Delete isn't there. So creation is only creation, is it? Task creation. Okay. Then its creation is only there, right? So in the future, obviously you will have to do a method, a view method for get, view method for create, view method for update, and then a view method for delete. Or you won't see views anymore because Django is going to finish. This is the last practical for Django. Next week we're doing express.js. We don't have NVT, we have NVC. So you will see controllers instead of views. Okay, so you need to write controllers for get, create, update, and delete. So today we are using a framework. The framework has done everything for us. Okay, so this framework is called TastyPie. Now let's go to the wiki. Now if you go to Advanced Django REST Framework. So this is the name of the framework, TastyPie. Right, so the first thing that you need to do is to install this framework. Pip install Django TastyPie. Just run that command, it'll install the framework. And then you have to go to your settings.py file and then register your framework, just like you have registered your app in the beginning. Alright, so let me register my framework. I have installed TastyPie already. Let's register the framework. Once you register the framework, you have to make sure. So let's go to the next step. So once you register the framework, you have to make sure that you are running any migrations, because TastyPie framework may need some tables in your database to work out the REST API. Does that make sense? Right. So to create tables, you can do make migrations. Make migrations, we'll see whether there are any changes pending. If there are no changes pending, it'll show you no changes detected. But it doesn't mean that there are pending migrations. There are no pending migrations. It doesn't mean that you have no pending migrations. So you need to use migrate to apply all the pending migrations. Do you see? There were a few pending migrations from TastyPie. Right. Let's go to the next step. Next step is to define a Django model. We already have a model, so you can skip this step. Our model is item. We don't have a book model. Our model is item. And then we have TastyPie resource. What is a resource? What do you guys think? Just look at this code and then tell me what the meaning of a resource. Yeah, object for what? We already have an object, right? We already have a model, isn't it? So it's an object. Why do we need a resource?
No.
And look at these actions. It'll give you some hints. But remember, those methods are attached to different API endpoints, different actions that the framework can do. Create, read, update, delete. So what do you think? It's a wrapper. It's a wrapper for your model. It's a wrapper for your model, and then this will define the properties of REST API. Let's say you don't want anyone to delete your items. So in that case, just remove that delete thingy from allowed methods. So in that case, using your REST API, nobody will be able to delete your items. Does that make sense? These are like the properties for the item object. It's a wrapper for your models. So if you have 10 models, you can have 10 wrappers. Each wrapper defines what actions that you can perform. This resource,
Not even from database.
not even from database means?
Like the user cannot delete the item from database.
No, this is through the API.
to the internet.
It's just from the outside request. Don't worry about the database. Database, you can definitely delete everything you want because you're the one who is developing it, and then pretty much users have access through the API. Remember that I told you users can only access the server through those API endpoints. There are no other way to access the database or to access something else in the in your server. It's kind of like API endpoints are like doors to your house. Of course, if you assume there are no windows, okay. So assume that you have a house without windows, you only have doors. There you go. You have a server with API endpoints. Right. So let's do this resource class. You need to create a new file. It's called api.py. Create this file inside your app. So I'm going to create this file inside my app. api.py. So create this file inside your app and then just paste that code and then do the changes necessary. So we don't have a model called book, but we have a model called item. And then make sure that your resource name is in simple letters, item. And then what do you think about authentication and authorization? Why do we need it? Give me a use case.
If you're audio,
Not everyone can use it.
yeah.
Not everyone can add items to the database. Some people need some authorization. Otherwise, anyone who sends a request to this API endpoint will make the server create an object. That's a big problem. If you allow everyone to delete object from your database, that's a big problem. You need to have some sort of an authentication. Authenticated users are allowed to do that. Does that make sense? Today we are not looking at authorization and authentication, therefore I'm going to comment that out. All good? So far so good? Right. That is step number 2. We defined our resource. We also registered the framework in the installed apps. What's the last step? Yes, URLs. You need to expose it to the outside world, right? The only way to do that is to edit your urs.py file. Okay, let's go to urs.py. Now here, there are a few things that you need to do. Once again, I'll take it from the wiki. I'll take a copy of this, then I'll explain. Right. So first of all, you need to import, well that is duplicate import. You need to import the API class from Tastypy API. Does that make sense? You need to import the API class from Tastypy API. You also need to import your item resource from your api.py. So it should be my app because your item resource is defined in api.py file in my app folder. So it should be my app.api import item resource. And then the first step is to create an Tastypy API instance. So you have created an API instance, and then you have to register your item resource, the wrapper for your model. Okay, and then the last step is adding the URL. So I'm going to remove these URL patterns from here, like that config, and then I'm going to put it over there. There you go. And then include is coming from well, that library, this package, Django URLs included. So what am I doing here? I'm including all the URLs coming from this API. Remember the endpoints? I'm adding those endpoints to my main url.py file. Right, that's done. So you can save all the work. Let's test the code. Let's test the REST API. Now when you send a request, remember it should start with API, right? It should be API, isn't it? API / because you are using a version here, you have to indicate the version as well. v1. This version is really important because let's say you change the REST API, let's say you change some of the properties of item resource model, like item resource class, then you can introduce another version of the same API. So your previous version is also there, your new version is also there. You can host multiple versions. All you need to do is just create another API instance with a different version and then add the URL parts over here. All good? Right. So how do you get all the items? /item. That's how you get all the items. If you send a request now, you have to start the server, by the way. Start the server. And then if you send a request, here we go, there you go. You have the objects. I only have 2 items in my database, so therefore I've got 2 items in my response. Now if you want to take a specific item from your database, you can say item /1 and then send a request. Well, 1 is not there, 3 is there, and then also 4 is there. Now did you notice something? When you want to get an unexisting item in your database, it just gives you a 404 not found, right? But that's not our custom 404 page. Why is it the case? Why is it like that? This is not our custom 404 page because in our custom 404 page we had a body, isn't it?
Because that's JSON.
You're right. You're okay. Close to the right answer.
It's server side.
No, this is dealt by the REST API framework. The framework itself, remember? All the URLs are added over here, and then when you send a request to that URL, everything else, whatever you do after that, is handled by this framework, this API instance. It's not handled by Django, it's actually handled by that framework, the app that you just installed. Does that make sense? So it has its own 404. And besides that, 404 does not have a body. Well, it makes sense because you don't need to send any body when you send the status code. And besides, if it's to send a body, then it needs to send JSON. Okay? Right.